The summer heat pressed down on Virginia like a heavy blanket. The air outside shimmered with humidity, thick and oppressive, clinging to every surface. Inside the small clinic just off the main highway, ceiling fans turned slowly, pushing the warm air around but never cooling it. The building wasn't fancy white walls, outdated chairs, and the faint smell of antiseptic clung to the hallways. It was the kind of place meant for sprained ankles, sore throats, and quick checkups, not emergencies. At exactly 3 in the afternoon, the front door creaked open. Claire stepped inside. She didn't burst in dramatically, didn't stumble in screaming for help. She walked with slow, deliberate steps, her left arm wrapped tightly in what looked like a torn piece of shirt, soaked deep red. Droplets of blood slipped past the cloth and fell onto the tiled floor, leaving a faint trail behind her. Her face, however, remained calm, eerily so. No tears, no trembling lips, no visible panic. The receptionist gasped softly, half rising from her chair. Before she could even speak, Jason Hall was already moving. Jason had seen enough blood to know this wasn't a scrape. He had spent years as a SEAL corpsman, patching up teammates in desert firefights and on storm-tossed seas. Now, after rotations overseas, he was temporarily assigned here while waiting on his next deployment orders. Most days were quiet sports injuries, minor accidents, nothing that challenged his training. But the sight of Claire made something in him sharpen instantly, the way it did on the battlefield. "Ma'am, sit here," Jason said firmly, pulling out a chair. Claire obeyed without a word. She lowered herself carefully, her posture upright despite the blood loss. Jason crouched beside her, eyes quickly scanning the improvised bandage. The cloth was wrapped with surprising precision, tight enough to slow bleeding, but not so tight that it would cut off circulation. He noticed the way she held pressure against the wound, not frantic, not sloppy. It was methodical, almost practiced. "Name?" Jason asked. "Claire," she said softly. Her voice was low, steady. "Claire, I'm Jason. I'm a medic. You're safe now, all right? Let me take a look." She gave a short nod, but said nothing more. Jason gestured for the receptionist to fetch supplies, then began unwrapping the bloodied fabric. His hands were steady. Years of field medicine had trained them well, but his mind was racing. Civilians didn't usually arrive like this. A wound wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind you got from slipping in the kitchen or cutting yourself on broken glass. It was jagged, torn at the edges. Something metallic, maybe shrapnel or twisted steel, had ripped through her skin. And yet, she didn't flinch. Not once. Jason had seen battle-hardened men hiss, curse, even cry out at wounds smaller than this. Pain usually showed itself, no matter how tough you were. But Claire sat silently, her eyes locked forward, as if she had already pushed the sensation into some dark corner of her mind. "Can you tell me what happened?" Jason asked carefully. Her gaze flicked to him, sharp and guarded, then back to the wall. She didn't answer. That silence told him more than words could. People who stayed quiet like that weren't just stubborn. They had learned silence somewhere, learned it because talking too much, revealing too much, could cost them. He had seen it in certain operators who worked black missions, and in locals overseas who had survived conflict zones. Silence was armor. He tightened the temporary dressing, pressing gauze against the wound. "You wrapped this yourself?" he asked, partly to keep her talking, partly because he was genuinely impressed. Claire gave the faintest nod. Jason studied her face. Sweat dotted her forehead, but not from panic, from the heat and blood loss. Her breathing stayed measured, even-paced, like someone deliberately keeping their heart rate under control. That wasn't normal. Civilians panicked. Civilians hyperventilated. Civilians lost composure. Claire was doing the exact opposite. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he asked finally, nodding at the way she had handled her injury. For the first time, her lips curved, just barely, into what might have been the shadow of a smile. Her eyes met his, and she spoke 4 words that sent a chill down his spine. "Training never leaves you." The words weren't loud, but they were heavy, spoken with the certainty of someone who had lived them. Jason froze. He had heard those exact words before, spoken by SEALs on deployment, Marines in combat, soldiers who had endured months of brutal conditioning. It wasn't something ordinary people said. He leaned back slightly, reassessing her. "Training?" he repeated. "What kind of training?" Claire didn't answer. Instead, she reached down and adjusted the bandage herself with surgical precision, her movements smooth despite the pain. Her silence filled the room, thicker than the antiseptic smell, pressing on Jason's nerves in a way that battlefield gunfire never had. The receptionist peeked in nervously. Jason waved her off, not taking his eyes from Claire. His instincts told him that this woman was not what she seemed. Most patients walked in carrying their pain on their sleeve. Claire walked in carrying secrets. Jason remembered once treating a SEAL teammate who had taken shrapnel to the thigh. The man had laughed through gritted teeth, joking to keep spirits high, but Jason had seen the effort it took. With Claire, there was no effort. No mask, just complete control. It was uncanny and a little unsettling. He tried again, softer this time. "Claire, where'd you learn to stay so calm?" Her eyes shifted, not with fear, but with calculation. She seemed to weigh the question, to measure how much she wanted him to know. Finally, she said, "You don't panic when panic gets you killed." Jason blinked. That was not an answer you heard from someone who lived an ordinary life. He tied off the bandage, his mind racing with possibilities. Was she military? Former law enforcement? Some kind of private training? Or was it something else entirely? Something darker? Something harder to explain? One thing was certain. This was no ordinary patient. And for reasons he couldn't fully understand, Jason felt his pulse quicken, not from the urgency of her wound, but from the mystery that walked in with her. The clinic room was silent, except for the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint squeak of Jason's gloves as he worked. Jason had been in countless situations where blood was spilled, but the quietness in this room felt heavier than the wound itself. Most patients filled the space with sound moans, nervous chatter, desperate questions. Claire filled it with nothing. She sat straight, her shoulders squared, her face composed. Her silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate, thick like a wall. Every second stretched longer as Jason studied her, trying to understand what kind of person reacted this way. He crouched closer, speaking in the steady tone he had used countless times with injured teammates. "All right, Claire, I'm going to clean this. It'll sting." No response. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. He gently swabbed the wound with antiseptic. The solution bit into the torn flesh. He had seen trained soldiers jolt at less, but Claire didn't move. Her jaw stayed firm, her breathing measured. Jason's instincts sharpened again. She wasn't ignoring the pain. She was controlling it, suppressing it with practiced discipline. Jason had treated Marines who used humor to hide their pain. He had patched up SEALs who cursed like wild men while squeezing a comrade's hand. Claire was something else entirely. Her method wasn't about distraction or release. It was about mastery. She was actively shutting her body down, keeping it from reacting. Jason leaned back slightly, searching her face. "You've done this before." Her eyes flicked toward him for half a second, then returned to a fixed point on the wall. The look wasn't defiance. It was calculation, as if she were measuring how much she wanted to reveal. He tried again. "What happened out there? Car accident? Tools? Something else?" Nothing. She pressed her own hand tighter against the dressing, her fingers positioned with surgical accuracy. Jason watched the way she moved, the way her tendons flexed beneath pale skin. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't clumsy. It was practiced. Jason felt a twinge of unease. Civilians didn't move like this. This was the kind of calm he'd seen on operators who had been taught to push through bullet wounds until extraction. This was discipline drilled in sweat, pain, and repetition. "Claire," Jason said quietly, "you're not acting like someone who just got cut up in an accident. You're acting like someone who's been trained to stay alive." Her lips pressed together slightly, then relaxed. Still silent. The receptionist re-entered, carrying extra gauze and a tray of instruments. She set them down carefully, darting a nervous glance between Jason and the woman. "Do you need me to call someone?" she whispered. Jason shook his head, waving her off. The fewer people involved, the better. Something about Claire told him this wasn't a situation to broadcast. Once they were alone again, Jason went back to work. He wrapped the wound tighter, securing it with clean gauze. The bleeding had slowed, but the damage was ugly. It wasn't smooth, like a knife cut. It was irregular, torn. "Doesn't look like glass," Jason murmured. He glanced up to catch her reaction, but she gave him none. He decided to try a different tactic. In the teams, he'd learned that silence sometimes cracked under casual curiosity more than direct questioning. "That bandage you made, it was good. Clean lines, solid pressure. Most people just tie a knot and hope for the best. You didn't. Where'd you pick that up?" Claire finally blinked, her eyes shifting from the wall to him. She didn't speak, but her expression sharpened, like a chess player considering a move. Jason raised his brows, waiting. "You don't panic," she said at last, her voice low, her words measured. "You don't waste time. You stop the bleeding." Her answer wasn't what he expected. It was practical, detached. The voice of someone who had lived with constant threat, not someone recalling a first aid seminar. Jason leaned back, crossing his arms. "You sound like you've been through this before." She looked away again, her jaw tightening. Silence. Jason felt his pulse pick up. He wasn't sure if it was from the adrenaline of patching her up or the gnawing curiosity about who she really was. Something inside him knew this wasn't just some unlucky woman with a freak accident. She carried herself with too much precision, too much control. He reached for fresh gauze and pressed it against her wound. "Look, I've patched up SEALs who lost half their blood and still cracked jokes. I've seen Marines scream their lungs out. But you..." He shook his head, staring at her. "You sit there like this is nothing. That's not normal." Her lips twitched faintly, but not into a smile. More like acknowledgement. As if she'd heard the truth in his words, but wasn't ready to confirm it. Jason's curiosity only deepened. The more she stayed quiet, the more he wanted to know. She was like a locked door, and every piece of composure she displayed was another bolt keeping it shut. "Tell me something," he said finally, lowering his voice. "Where did you train?" The question hung in the air like static. Jason expected her to brush it off or act confused. Most civilians would laugh nervously, maybe ask what he meant. Claire didn't. Instead, her gaze lifted slowly, deliberately, until her eyes locked with his. There was no hesitation, no avoidance. "Training never leaves you," she said softly. Jason's heart skipped. He knew that line. He'd said it himself once, years ago, after his first deployment. It was something soldiers told each other when they returned home, when they still woke in the night reaching for weapons, when their bodies remembered drills long after they left the field. No ordinary person said that. Jason studied her, his mind racing. Her posture, her silence, her control, it all aligned. But she had no uniform, no insignia, No sign of belonging to the brotherhoods he knew. If she had served, where? If she hadn't, then how in the hell did she know? The silence between them deepened. Jason wrapped the final layer of gauze, securing it neatly, but his thoughts weren't on the wound anymore. They were on her words. Training never leaves you. They echoed in his head, unsettling him more than the blood on his gloves. Jason's fingers worked with the calm efficiency of long habit, but his mind was anything but calm. He had seen plenty of wounds in his career: bullet holes, burns, shrapnel tears, but this one told a story. The flesh around the gash was uneven, ragged at the edges, almost as though something had ripped rather than sliced. It wasn't a kitchen knife accident, and it wasn't broken glass either. Jason had treated enough lacerations from bar fights and clumsy accidents to know the difference. This wound looked like the kind left behind by metal under force-sharp steel, splintered wreckage, maybe even a fragment of something explosive. But Claire didn't give him a single clue. Her breathing stayed slow, measured. Her posture was rigid, her gaze focused on the white wall ahead of her, as if she'd painted her attention there and refused to let it stray. Jason swabbed the wound again with antiseptic, watching closely for a reaction. He expected a flinch, a hiss of breath, maybe even a clenched jaw. Nothing came. Her control wasn't human, it was surgical. Jason had been in situations where medics screamed louder than their patients. Pain had a way of dragging sound out of people, whether they wanted it or not. Claire, though, was silence embodied. "You know," Jason said carefully, as though trying not to spook a wild animal, "most people don't hold themselves this steady, especially with something like this." Claire didn't answer. Jason tightened the gauze, his hands steady, but his thoughts tumbling. The silence pressed on him, more unnerving than screams could ever be. Silence on the battlefield usually meant one thing: danger. A man who went quiet during treatment was either unconscious or hiding something. He decided to test her. "You've been through this before," Jason said, not as a question but as a statement. Her eyes flicked to his briefly, then returned to the wall. Jason leaned closer, his voice dropping to the tone he used when coaxing truth out of wounded teammates. "Tell me, Claire, where'd you train?" For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, slowly, her gaze shifted. Her eyes met his, calm but sharp, as though measuring his worth before granting him an answer. And then she spoke. "Training never leaves you." The words hit Jason harder than the sight of her wound. His body stilled, his breath caught. Those 4 words weren't casual. They were code. They were mantra. He had heard them intense under desert stars, in muddy trenches, in quiet moments after firefights. They were words spoken by warriors who had endured something that could never be erased. Jason froze, staring at her. He had told rookies the same thing, that training wasn't just drills, it was instinct. That once you were forged by it, you could never truly let it go. It lived in your breathing, your heartbeat, the way you reacted when the world turned violent. For Claire to say that here, in this quiet clinic, meant something. Jason swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "You've served?" he asked carefully. Her expression didn't change. No confirmation. No denial. Just that faint, unreadable look, like she knew far more than she planned to share. Jason studied her posture, her stillness. He thought of all the men he'd treated who came back from war. They had the same gaze, the one that didn't wander, didn't soften, the one that stayed locked on a fixed point so they could keep themselves anchored. Claire had that gaze. But she didn't have the scars of service he could see. No faded tattoos, no calloused knuckles, no tan lines from dog tags. She looked ordinary in every way, except for the way she carried herself. Jason's instincts buzzed. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a classified file, one stamped in red ink with restricted access. "What kind of training?" he asked finally. Claire's lips curved just barely, not into a smile, but into something else. An acknowledgement that he'd stepped closer to the truth, though not close enough to touch it. "Does it matter?" she said softly. Jason frowned. Of course it mattered. Training defined you. It determined what you could endure, how you survived. SEALs trained differently from Marines. Rangers carried a different rhythm from Air Force operators. But Claire was something else entirely. He leaned back, running a hand over his jaw. "It matters because I need to know who I'm treating. If this wound came from something bigger than you're saying, I need to understand." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as though she were dissecting his words. "You need to know," she repeated, almost to herself. Jason recognized the deflection. He'd seen it in interrogations, in debriefs, in conversations where men carried secrets they couldn't spill. His frustration mounted, but so did his curiosity. This woman was a puzzle wrapped in calmness. She shouldn't have been here, sitting silently in a clinic. She belonged somewhere else, somewhere harsher, darker. Jason pressed again, lowering his voice. "Look, Claire, civilians don't talk like that. They don't say things like, 'Training never leaves you.' They don't sit through treatment without flinching. They don't wrap wounds like pros. So if you want me to believe, you're just some unlucky woman who cut herself sorry. But I can't." Her gaze met his again. For the briefest moment, Jason thought he saw something flicker their pain. Not physical, but buried deep, the kind that lived in memory. And then it was gone. She exhaled slowly, controlled. Her silence returned, heavier than before. Jason turned back to the gauze, finishing the dressing in silence. But his thoughts raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why did it feel like the answer mattered more than the wound itself? Jason had stitched up countless men under fire, patched bullet holes by flashlight, and dragged bleeding comrades across sand that burned like coals. He thought he had seen composure in its purest form. But this was different. Claire sat across from him with blood drying against pale skin, posture steady, eyes sharp. He couldn't decide if she unsettled him because she reminded him of his brothers in arms, or because she didn't fit anywhere in his categories of understanding. "Military?" he asked again, leaning forward slightly. "Law enforcement? Special courses?" Her lips twitched into a faint curve, a ghost of a smile, one that carried no warmth. It was the kind of smile that said everything and nothing at once. "None of those," she said quietly. The words dropped like a stone in the room, rippling through Jason's thoughts. None? He replayed every motion she had made since stepping inside. The precision of her bandage, the way she held herself, the discipline of her breathing. None of it matched none. Jason narrowed his eyes. "You expect me to believe that?" Claire tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Believe what you want." Her calmness gnawed at him. He had interrogated men who cracked under far less pressure. Silence was one thing. Evasion was another. But this was control in its purest form. Not defensive, not panicked, controlled. Jason wrapped another layer of gauze around her arm, his hands steady while his thoughts buzzed. He had seen precision like this in places most civilians never even imagined existed. But those places always had uniforms, insignias, or shadows of them. Claire had none. "You're disciplined," Jason said finally, testing her. Her gaze flicked to him, the faintest acknowledgement. "That doesn't come from nowhere," he pressed. Claire's eyes softened for just a second so brief, Jason almost missed it. Then the wall came back up. "Does it matter where it comes from?" she asked. Jason leaned back, frustrated. It matters to me. You're bleeding in my chair, and you've got the presence of someone who's been through hell, but won't admit it. Yeah, it matters. Claire said nothing. Instead, she adjusted her posture, spine straighter, shoulders squared. It was a soldier's posture, though she denied the title. Jason couldn't look away. The silence stretched until Jason finally sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. You know, I've seen guys twice your size fall apart under pressure. I've seen them beg for morphine, cry for their mothers. But you, he stopped, searching for the right words. You sit there like it's Tuesday afternoon. Like this doesn't matter. Her eyes locked with his then, steady and unblinking. Because it doesn't, she said simply. Jason frowned. What do you mean, it doesn't? Claire's voice remained level. Pain comes, pain goes. Wounds heal or they don't. But losing focus, she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Losing focus is what gets you killed. Jason's stomach tightened. That wasn't something you picked up in a self-defense class or from watching too many movies. That was the voice of experience, the kind you only earned in the hardest ways possible. Where did you hear that? He asked, his voice quieter now. Her faint smile returned, that same tired, enigmatic curve of lips. Life teaches fast if you're paying attention. Jason studied her face. Her features were soft, almost ordinary, but the way she held herself made her extraordinary. She wasn't boasting. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply telling the truth, stripped of pretense. And it unsettled him more than any battlefield ever had. Jason tightened the final wrap of gauze, securing it with tape. He leaned back on his stool, crossing his arms. He wanted to push harder, demand answers, peel back the layers of silence she wore like armor. But something told him it would be useless. Claire wasn't going to hand him her story just because he wanted it. You're a mystery, he muttered, half to himself. Claire's gaze didn't waver. Mysteries are safer that way. The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Jason couldn't tell if she meant safer for her or for him. He stood slowly, pulling off his gloves. His body language betrayed nothing, but inside, his curiosity burned. He had treated hundreds of people, but never had he been this intrigued, this unsettled, this drawn in. Claire was different. He knew it, and he suspected she knew he knew it. Jason leaned on the counter, his voice softer now. You don't owe me details. But you should know something. I can see discipline when it's in front of me. Doesn't matter if it came from a drill instructor, a battlefield, or... He gestured vaguely at her. Wherever you got it. It's there. And it's not normal. For the first time, Claire's eyes shifted, not evasive, not guarded. There was something else in them now. Weariness. A weight he recognized all too well. The kind soldiers carried when they'd seen more than they wanted, but had no choice but to live with it. Jason recognized it because he carried it too. He opened his mouth to press further, but stopped. That look, the one buried under layers of control, told him that whatever her story was, it wasn't his to drag out. Not yet. Instead, he said quietly, You don't have to tell me. But I see it. Claire's lips parted, then closed again. She gave a faint nod, as though acknowledging his words, but offering nothing more. The silence between them wasn't hostile now. It was heavy, yes, but different, almost like a shared understanding, unspoken but undeniable. Jason stood straighter, exhaling slowly. He had no answers. But he knew one thing for certain. Claire was no ordinary woman. And whatever had forged her discipline was something darker than he could imagine. And that smile, small, tired, but unshakably calm, said he'd only scratched the surface. Jason had patched soldiers with shrapnel in their thighs and arms, medics with burns from explosives, and civilians with cuts from car wrecks. But Claire's wound, and the woman herself, defied every expectation. The more he looked at her, the more he realized she carried not just physical injury, but a history written in silence. In control, in discipline that hadn't come from him, or the battlefield, or any academy he knew. Claire. He started carefully, glancing at her pale but steady face. You've got a precision here, a way of handling yourself that comes from experience. Not everyone's born with it. You've lived it. Her gaze flicked toward him, sharp and calculating. Experience doesn't need a uniform, she said softly. Jason paused. That simple statement carried weight he couldn't ignore. He had assumed discipline came from formal instruction boot camps, SEAL training, military hierarchy. But here she was, no uniform, no badges, yet moving with the same poise he had seen in the world's toughest operators. Then tell me, Jason said gently, where did you learn this? Her eyes shifted to the window, watching the heat shimmer across the parking lot outside. A small shadow passed over her face, a fleeting flicker of memory. Life, she whispered. Jason blinked. Life? She nodded, her fingers pressing the gauze against her arm. Life taught me fast. Pain, fear. Sometimes the only way to survive is to master yourself before the world does it for you. Jason's heart skipped. He had seen warriors molded by war, but Claire had been molded by something else, entirely something relentless, invisible, but no less brutal. What do you mean? He pressed. Claire drew a slow breath, her gaze fixed on the wall again. I grew up where danger was constant. Every night there were sirens, shouting, things breaking outside. You learned quickly either you were alert or you didn't wake up the next morning. Jason's mind raced. He pictured her childhood home, the streets alive with unpredictable threats. No classroom, no drill instructor, just raw necessity. I ran, she continued, her voice low and steady. Miles before the sun came up, every morning, building stamina in case I needed to get out. I learned how to breathe under pressure, how to keep my heart steady when it raced, how to focus when fear tried to overwhelm me. Jason found himself holding his breath. He had trained men for war, had drilled them for hours on escape, evasion, survival, but nothing compared to what Claire had endured. Her instructors hadn't been sergeants or officers. They had been the streets, the night, life itself. You did this alone? He asked, almost afraid of the answer. She nodded. No one came when I called. No one checked if I was okay. You learn to take care of yourself, or you don't take care of yourself at all. Jason swallowed. He could feel a knot forming in his stomach. The weight of her words was heavy, far heavier than the wound he was treating. He had witnessed suffering, yes, but hers carried a quiet ferocity that resonated differently. You had to teach yourself everything, he said softly, almost in awe. Survival, control, endurance. Claire's jaw tightened slightly. Control isn't optional when danger is constant. Endurance isn't a choice. Survival is mandatory. Jason thought about the hours he had spent training with elite teams, watching recruits push their bodies past exhaustion, being drilled in obedience and discipline. Claire had accomplished all that alone. No team, no guidance, no recognition, just life demanding it. You're remarkable, he said quietly, almost a whisper. Claire's eyes met his for the first time in a long moment. There was no arrogance in them, only tired acknowledgement. I didn't ask to be, I just survived. Jason nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. I've seen men with medals fall apart under less, he admitted. And you've been tested every day of your life, and you sit here like this. She didn't answer immediately. She adjusted the bandage with precision, pressing the gauze exactly where it needed to be, as if the act itself was a meditation. "Pain teaches you," she said finally. "It teaches you faster than any drill, any instructor, any lesson written down. You learn not to flinch because flinching costs you more than the injury itself." Jason realized then that Claire's composure, her silence, her every calculated motion, was the product of a lifetime spent in survival mode. Her training wasn't handed down by someone in a uniform. It had been carved out by necessity, honed by years of vigilance and fear, and reinforced with every danger she had survived. "And that's why," she added, her voice quiet but firm, "you don't see people like me crumble at minor injuries. The body learns to follow the mind. The mind learns to ignore pain. The only thing that breaks is the unprepared." Jason couldn't help but respect her more. He had trained for endurance, for discipline, for moments like these. But Claire had done it without structure, without recognition, without anyone teaching her it was even possible. And she had survived. "You never had anyone to guide you?" he asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Her gaze softened momentarily. "No, you learn who your enemies are, who your friends are. And mostly, you learn that you have to be your own teacher. That's how life prepares you when no one else will." Jason sat back on his stool, letting the silence between them settle. He had no words, not really. He had witnessed courage before, bravery under fire, discipline in extreme conditions, but nothing quite like this. Claire's strength didn't come from formalized drills or orders from a superior. It came from raw, unfiltered survival, forced by circumstances that would have crushed ordinary people. "I'm impressed," Jason admitted finally. "You've survived more than most people could even imagine. And you didn't just survive, you mastered yourself. That's incredible." Claire's lips curved faintly, a small acknowledgement. It wasn't about being incredible. It was about not dying. Jason smiled slightly, though it was tinged with a strange admiration. He had seen warriors. He had seen discipline. He had seen fear. But here, in this quiet clinic room, with blood drying on her arm and a calmness that refused to break, he realized that life itself could forge a warrior sharper than any academy. He stood slowly, stretching his legs. "You've taught me something today," he said. "Discipline isn't always about drills. It's about endurance, control, and surviving the things life throws at you. I can see it in you." Claire nodded silently, adjusting her bandage again. She didn't ask for praise. She didn't need validation. She survived, and that was enough. Jason felt humbled. He had treated heroes, soldiers, and trained men, but Claire's resilience had a different kind of weight. It was raw, real, earned from circumstances most would never endure. And yet, despite everything, she sat quietly in front of him, composed and unwavering. And in that quiet, Jason realized one truth. Some of the strongest people he would ever meet would never wear a uniform, never carry a medal, and never tell their story. They simply survived, taught themselves, and carried on. Claire had done exactly that. Jason stepped back from the counter, his hands still tingling from the sterile gloves he'd just removed. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and sweat, but that wasn't what pressed against him. It was Claire. Every fiber of her presence radiated a quiet, formidable strength. He had treated elite soldiers, men who had endured firestorms, storms at sea, and the darkest corners of combat. But she carried something different, something harder to define. It wasn't skill alone. It was the weight of years surviving on her own, of fighting invisible wars daily. He leaned against the counter, watching her adjust her bandage once more. Her movements were precise, methodical. Every motion had been honed by necessity. Every breath calculated. He had spoken to countless operators about survival instincts and the discipline of experience. But Claire embodied those lessons in a raw, natural form. It wasn't trained. It was earned. "You know," Jason said finally, his voice quieter than usual, "I've always thought I understood resilience. I've patched up men who lost limbs, dealt with bleeding colleagues, and endured far worse than this clinic sees in a week. But you're something else entirely." Claire didn't answer immediately. She simply tilted her head, watching him as though weighing his words for their honesty. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't choose this. It wasn't about being strong. It was about surviving. Nothing else mattered." Jason nodded slowly, taking in the gravity of her words. He could see the truth in them. Most of his patients had a choice in the matter. They had orders, teams, protocols. Claire had none. She had to become her own guide, her own protector, her own teacher. The survival instincts he had learned in structured environments were second nature to her, yet she had cultivated them alone, under far harsher conditions. He remembered the first time he had witnessed untrained civilians collapse under stress. Panic was primal. Fear was instinctive. But Claire had none of that. Her face remained calm, her breathing steady, even as her arm led beneath his gaze. The wound was serious, yet she treated it with careful precision, as if it were a minor inconvenience. That composure, that absolute control, unsettled him more than any battlefield scenario ever had. "Why never ask for help?" he asked gently, leaning closer. Claire's eyes darkened for a fraction of a second, the faintest shadow crossing her features. "Because no one came when I called," she said simply, her words measured. Jason felt the weight of that sentence press down on him. He had heard it before, in other contexts, battlefields, civilian tragedies, but hearing it from someone so composed and alive, someone so capable, hit differently. It explained everything. Her silence, her independence, her refusal to reveal more than necessary. She had learned to survive alone because the world had refused to intervene. "And that's why you—" Jason paused, trying to find the words. "Carry yourself like this?" Claire nodded. "Yes. You don't get to rely on anyone else if relying on them means you die. You adapt or you don't survive. That's all there is." Jason rubbed his jaw, absorbing her perspective. He had been trained to trust his team implicitly, to function as part of a unit where every man and woman covered another's back. Claire had no such luxury. Her discipline had been honed in isolation. Her resilience had no backup plan. And yet she existed here, wounded but unbroken, embodying a level of self-control that rivaled the most elite operators he had ever known. He looked at her, finally allowing a hint of admiration to show in his eyes. "I've always believed endurance came from structured drills, repetition, and teamwork," he said quietly. "But you've endured more than any of us could imagine, without any of that. And you're still standing." Claire's lips twitched faintly, not into a smile, but into acknowledgement. She didn't seek praise. She didn't need it. Survival had taught her that recognition was optional. Endurance was mandatory. Jason felt humbled. He had spent years instructing, training, and treating warriors who relied on structure, but Claire's strength was independent of all that. Her survival skills were organic, honed through necessity and fear, reinforced with every danger she had faced. She was self-taught, self-reliant, and impossibly disciplined. "You shock me," Jason admitted finally. "I've treated men who were twice your size, veterans who've seen things most people can't imagine. And yet, you sit here calmly with a wound like this. You don't flinch. You don't panic. You just endure." Claire's gaze met his, unwavering. "You don't collapse when collapsing means you won't get back up," she said simply. Jason exhaled slowly. That line hit him harder than any physical blow ever had. He had trained to endure pain, to remain functional under stress, to push through fear, but Claire had internalized that principle from a life far more brutal than his training had ever simulated. She had learned to survive because survival was the only option. Endurance wasn't taught, it was demanded by circumstance. He realized something else then. Claire's story wasn't just about resilience or discipline. It was about independence. It was about mastering oneself in a world that offered no support. She had forged her strength from necessity, from fear, from the constant threat of danger. Every motion, every decision, every breath she took had been refined to maximize survival. Jason felt a mix of respect, awe, and humility. He had met heroes, but few had impressed him like this. Few had endured so much alone and emerged not broken, but composed, strategic, and unyielding. "You carry a lot," Jason said softly, almost to himself. "More than anyone should ever have to." Claire's gaze softened for a moment, the faintest flicker of vulnerability crossing her features before it vanished behind her usual calm. "I don't have a choice," she said. "It's just life. You survive or you don't. That's all." Jason nodded slowly, understanding in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't just physical endurance. It was psychological, emotional, and moral. Claire had lived through trials that demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and self-control. Every lesson was internalized, every skill honed without guidance, without reinforcement, without validation. And yet, she had survived. Jason realized then that her silence was not defiance. It was armor. Her calm was not arrogance. It was survival. And her resilience was not learned in drills or classrooms. It was forged in the crucible of necessity. He stood slowly, stretching his legs, feeling both admiration and a strange kinship. "You've taught me something today," he said quietly. "Strength isn't always about formal training or medals. Sometimes it's about surviving when no one else is there to teach you how." Claire adjusted the bandage again, pressing the gauze with meticulous care. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't offer words of thanks. She simply existed, calm and steady, a living lesson in endurance, independence, and quiet strength. Jason watched her for a long moment, humbled by the realization that some of the strongest people he would ever meet would never wear a uniform, never receive recognition, and never boast of their accomplishments. They simply survived. They endured. And they carried on. Claire had done exactly that. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the clinic's blinds, dust motes dancing in the warm air like tiny, silent witnesses. Jason leaned against the counter, watching Claire adjust the bandage on her arm with meticulous care. Her movements were precise, efficient, and unwavering, even as her pale fingers pressed the gauze with measured pressure. He had patched up countless soldiers and civilians in his career, but he had never encountered anyone with such quiet mastery of their own body and mind. He ran a hand across his jaw, feeling a knot of admiration mixed with unease. Claire had endured more than most people would ever imagine, yet she sat before him, composed, almost indifferent to the pain that would have crippled anyone else. It was unsettling and awe-inspiring all at once. "You really shock me," he said quietly, trying to find the words. "I've treated men who have gone through hell and back. Twice their size, twice their age, and yet they break. You just sit there." Claire's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "You don't collapse when collapsing means you won't get back up," she said softly. Jason exhaled slowly. That statement struck harder than any physical blow could. He had trained soldiers to endure, to push through fear, to function under chaos. But she had internalized that principle through a lifetime of living in constant danger. Her strength wasn't built in gyms or drill fields. It had been carved from necessity, from threat, from relentless survival. He leaned closer, curiosity overtaking professional detachment. "Do you ever feel fear?" he asked carefully. Claire's jaw tightened slightly. Her eyes flicked toward the window, as if seeing a memory flash across the glass. "Of course I do," she admitted. "Fear is always there, but I control it. I don't let it control me." Jason felt the weight of those words settle over him. He had trained men to master fear, to regulate their bodies and minds under extreme pressure. But no drill could replicate the life she had lived. No classroom could teach constant vigilance and self-discipline forged alone in hostile circumstances. She had become her own teacher, her own guide, her own protector. He ran a hand through his hair. "And no one ever taught you?" Claire shook her head faintly. "No one. You either learn, or you don't survive." Jason's gaze lingered on her. He saw the faint shadows under her eyes, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers pressed against the gauze with exacting care. Every detail told him that she had been tempered by experience, honed by life's harshest lessons, and yet had emerged unbroken, disciplined, and resolute. "You've endured more than anyone should have to," he said quietly, almost a whisper. "And you've done it alone." She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she straightened her posture, shoulders squared, gaze forward. Jason realized she didn't need to speak to affirm her resilience. It radiated from every motion, every breath, every silent second she allowed to pass. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked finally. Claire's lips curved faintly, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. "Tired isn't the same as broken," she said. "You rest when you can, but the world doesn't stop just because you're tired. You adapt, or you don't." Jason swallowed, his respect deepening. He had treated soldiers who relied on orders, on structure, on their teams. Claire had none of that. Her strength was self-contained, self-reliant, forged by constant vigilance and unrelenting necessity. And it was humbling to witness. He leaned back against the counter, watching her in silence. The clinic's air felt thick, charged with unspoken understanding. He didn't need to ask the questions he wanted answers. Claire had revealed enough through her composure, her discipline, her quiet mastery of her own body. Jason's admiration was tempered by unease. He realized that her abilities weren't just impressive, they were dangerous. She could navigate situations he couldn't predict, endure pain he couldn't imagine, and operate in ways most people, even highly trained soldiers, could not anticipate. And yet she had no affiliation, no guidance, no team. She was a solitary force, disciplined, independent, and lethal in her own right. "You've taught me something today," he said softly. "Strength isn't just about training or medals. Sometimes it's about surviving when no one else is there to teach you how. And you embody that." Claire nodded faintly, adjusting the bandage once more. Her eyes softened slightly, just enough for Jason to glimpse a shadow of the vulnerability she carried beneath her calm exterior. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't seek validation. She simply existed, a living testament to the endurance of the human spirit under relentless pressure. Jason's thoughts drifted to the implications of what he had learned. Claire's skills were extraordinary. They weren't just physical or tactical. They were mental, emotional, and intuitive. She could read a room, control her responses, endure injury, and act decisively. In a world filled with danger, she was equipped in ways he had only seen in elite operatives. Yet she had no official affiliation, no support, no backup. The thought unsettled him. In the wrong circumstances, her abilities could be exploited or worse, targeted. And that realization only deepened his respect for the quiet resilience she displayed every moment of her life. "You know," he said after a pause, "most people would crumble under the pressure you've lived with. And yet, here you are, calm, collected, unbroken. Claire met his gaze evenly. Because breaking isn't an option. Not for me. Not for anyone who wants to survive. Jason exhaled slowly. He realized that her strength wasn't a gift or a talent, it was a necessity, forged through years of living in a world that offered no protection. She had mastered herself because she had to. She had endured the unendurable, and that endurance had become second nature. He studied her closely, noting the faint tension in her shoulders, the controlled rhythm of her breathing, the calculated precision of her movements. Every detail reinforced the truth he had already intuited. Claire was extraordinary, shaped by circumstances most could not imagine, and utterly self-sufficient. And that's why you can sit here quietly while bleeding, he said softly, almost to himself. Because pain is just another variable, another obstacle. You've already mastered it. Claire's lips curved faintly, a small acknowledgement. She didn't need to say more. Jason understood. Her silence was part of her strength. Her calm was part of her strategy. And her resilience was part of her survival. He leaned back, letting the moment settle. He had no words that could fully encapsulate what he felt. Admiration, respect, unease, and awe all mingled together. He realized that some of the strongest people he would ever meet wouldn't wear uniforms, carry weapons, or display medals. They would simply survive, endure, and carry on. And Claire was one of them. Jason glanced at her one last time before leaving the room to fetch fresh bandages. She sat there, composed and silent, a living example of strength that didn't require recognition. He couldn't help but feel humbled, and perhaps a little unnerved, by the sheer magnitude of her discipline, independence, and resilience. He knew, without a doubt, that he had encountered someone extraordinary. And he also knew that her story was far from finished. Jason returned to the clinic room with fresh bandages in hand, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, blending with the soft ticking of a wall clock. Claire had shifted slightly, but her composure remained unshaken. She looked up as he entered, meeting his gaze with the same calm, deliberate attention she had displayed since the moment she arrived. He felt a subtle mix of respect and unease settle in his chest. Throughout the day, he had witnessed precision, resilience, and control that defied ordinary understanding. The wound on her arm was minor compared to the story her silence told. The story of a life forged in constant pressure, danger, and isolation. Jason carefully inspected the dressing she had applied herself. It was neat, meticulous, and efficient, more than adequate to stabilize her arm. Yet he knew the act of treating oneself with such precision under duress was rare, even among elite operators. "You've impressed me," he said quietly, almost to himself. "More than anyone I've treated in years." Claire's gaze remained steady, and her faint, ghostly smile hinted at acknowledgement without pride. "Impressing isn't the goal," she said softly. "Surviving is." Jason nodded. He had been a medic for decades, and he knew the difference. Pride was optional. Survival was absolute. Her words carried the weight of experience, honed not in classrooms or bases, but in life's harshest crucibles. He applied a new layer of gauze over her wound, taping it firmly. "I've treated soldiers who collapsed at half this. I've seen fear take men under. And you don't even flinch. How do you do it?" Claire's eyes briefly softened, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing her otherwise composed face. "Because I don't have the option to flinch," she said. "If I break, I die. If I hesitate, I die. The lessons are simple. Discipline isn't an elective. It's survival." Jason felt the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. He had trained men to endure, to persevere, to control themselves under stress. But Claire's mastery went beyond structured training. She had internalized the principles of survival through necessity, isolation, and repeated exposure to danger. She wasn't just disciplined. She was a force shaped by life itself. He stood back for a moment, studying her. So this, all of this, the control, the calmness, it's just who you are? Claire nodded slowly. It's what life demanded of me. I didn't choose it, but I learned it. And I rely on it every day. Jason exhaled slowly, letting the words settle in his mind. He realized then that he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. Someone whose strength was not just physical, but mental and emotional. Forged by experience, honed through necessity, and reinforced by countless trials. You make me realize, he said softly, almost in awe, that discipline isn't about training alone. It's about endurance, control, and responding when no one else is there to guide you. And you embody all of that. Claire's lips curved faintly in acknowledgement. She didn't seek validation, but she understood it when offered. She had learned to survive without reliance, yet she recognized the respect in Jason's voice. Jason leaned against the counter, his gaze lingering on her as if trying to memorize every detail: the posture, the calm expression, the meticulous movements. He had seen heroes before, men and women decorated for bravery, trained under intense conditions. But Claire's heroism was quiet, unrecognized, and absolute. It didn't seek acknowledgement. It simply existed, a testament to what the human spirit could endure and achieve when necessity demanded it. You carry a heavy weight, Jason said finally, his voice low. And yet, you make it seem effortless. Claire looked at him, her eyes reflecting faint traces of fatigue, but unwavering in their resolve. It's not effortless. It's required. You adapt, or you don't survive. That's all there is. Jason felt a shiver of understanding. He had faced countless emergencies, had witnessed panic and fear in abundance. Yet here she was, composed in both body and mind, demonstrating the rarest form of strength, mastery over self under relentless adversity. You've changed the way I see resilience, he admitted. I thought I understood endurance, but you've redefined it for me. Quiet, controlled, absolute, and terrifying in its way. Claire's lips curved faintly, a subtle acknowledgement of the rare compliment. She didn't boast. She didn't need to. Her strength spoke louder than any words could. Jason straightened, taking a deep breath. I don't know what the future holds for you, or what dangers you've faced before today, but I do know one thing. You're remarkable. Not just for surviving, but for carrying that survival like armor without letting it define you entirely. Claire's eyes softened momentarily, the barest hint of emotion breaking through her disciplined exterior. I don't carry it for recognition, she said. I carry it because I must, and because I can. Jason nodded slowly, feeling both admiration and unease settle in him. Claire was a silent force, a woman who had endured, mastered, and survived in ways few could comprehend. She was a testament to human resilience and quiet heroism, the kind that often went unnoticed, but could withstand any storm. He realized that their time together had left a lasting impression, not because of the wound or the treatment, but because of what Claire embodied: discipline forged in isolation, endurance refined under pressure, and a will to survive that defied ordinary comprehension. Jason glanced at her one last time, a sense of profound respect settling in his chest. You're extraordinary, Claire, he said quietly, and I doubt you'll ever know how many people would be inspired just by knowing what you've endured. Claire's faint smile remained, calm and unreadable. I do what I must, she said simply. That's enough. Jason knew he had learned something invaluable today about resilience, strength, and the quiet power of someone who had faced danger alone and emerged unbroken. He had treated soldiers, heroes, and survivors before, but none had left as profound an impression as Claire. She had taught him that true strength was not always loud or recognized, but steadfast, silent, and absolute. As he left the room, Jason took one last glance at Claire. She remained seated, poised, and composed, her bandaged arm resting on her lap. She was a living testament to endurance, discipline, and survival, an extraordinary presence that could not be measured by medals or accolades. And in that quiet clinic room, Jason realized something undeniable. The strongest people he would ever meet would not necessarily wear uniforms, carry titles, or announce their victories. Some would simply survive, endure, and carry on. Claire had done exactly that, and in her silence, she had spoken volumes.